Jen Leone. Whoops, let me make sure I get that on the recording for the record. Hi, everybody. This is Jen Leone, Chief Sustainability Officer at HPD. If you don't know me, thank you for joining. I want to welcome Solar One, excuse me, for this Solar for Designers presentation, which I'm glad for everybody who's chosen to join, because it's a really good resource for designers and anybody else thinking about how to incorporate solar on affordable housing projects. The only thing I can say with that is stay tuned. There's a lot of really good tips in here, and this will help really make affordable solar and expand access to solar for low income communities in New York City. And I will turn it over to Solar One because I don't know who's starting. And unfortunately, I have to run out for another meeting. But we look forward to this, and it will be recorded for future use. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thanks for taking the time to do this as well as the other meeting that you have at exactly the same time. Thanks everyone for joining. We will get started. Maybe I'll take a little extra time on the agenda to allow some more people to trickle in, but let's go over what we're going to talk about today. So I want to give some quick background on the New York City solar context. We'll do a little bit of Solar 101 and also talk about the economics of solar. And then we'll go into detail about how to best design a building for solar if you're starting from scratch and you have the opportunity to do whatever you want, what's the best case scenario for solar. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the process of getting to installation, including solar in the process, specifically in the context of HPD development. And then we'll do a couple of case studies and examples. We have Q&A at the end, but actually we will also have space for questions at the end of each one of these sections. So feel free to write questions in the chat or the Q&A section, or raise your hand and we can take you off mute. And we can answer questions about each one of these different topics as we go. So it's always better with more questions. So anything that comes to mind, we're happy to answer and have this be more of a discussion than a monologue. Always more fun that way. So let's get started. Just to give you a bit of background on where we are with solar in New York City. As you probably know, solar is growing dramatically around the country and the world. Costs have gone down. They're essentially close to zero compared to where they started in the 70s. And because of that, installations have increased exponentially in many cases. And in the past few years, that has only continued. But in New York, there's still a lot of barriers that people face. There's, as I'm sure you all know, a lot of construction red tape in New York City. And multifamily buildings are just inherently more complex than a single family house out in the suburbs. Same thing goes for the fact that there's lots of buildings right next to each other, and some buildings shade other buildings, and the design and construction for that is more difficult. And then, of course, any complexity that you face in New York is doubled because of the complexity working with developing affordable housing. So we created Here Comes Solar as part of Solar One to address those issues. So Solar One is a environmental education nonprofit. We do all sorts of different things. There's a workforce training component on solar and energy efficiency and other building trades. We have a clean energy education program in New York City public schools. We have a park on the East River, and the Here Comes Solar program is specifically created to address all of those barriers and make it just as easy for New Yorkers to go solar as anyone else in the country. So we do the initial site viability, we do knowledge building, so workshops like this and individual knowledge building with, co-op boards and building owners and residents. We also do consulting about the incentives that might be available, financing options, although that's less of an issue here because anyone in this context already has financing. And then maybe most importantly, we help building owners select a solar installer who will do the project well. And then hopefully this isn't something that needs to be done, but we also provide advocacy during installation. If something goes wrong or if there's any troubleshooting that needs to be done, we're there throughout the whole process. So we just try to make it as easy and simple as possible with the solar installers. So in 2020, NYSERDA funded a partnership with HPD and Solar One to support the SolarWare Feasible mandate, which we'll be talking about more. So Solar One is the official technical assistance provider for any HPD project. So whether it's going through the new construction program, whether it's preservation, or even in the asset management portfolios, any building that has HPD funding, we can provide these services for free and do all the time. So a couple of reasons why it's worth it to go solar. The first thing that I think we should talk about is the fact that it's just really important for the climate, obviously. As I'm sure you've heard the statistic a million times now, but in New York City, buildings account for 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so solar can certainly reduce that by covering the electricity. And I think that that's especially important in New York because there are peaker power plants which only turn on at the peak load times of the year, which are usually in the afternoons in the summer when everyone's running their air conditioners. And that's when solar can produce the most. And it's the dirtiest fuel that there is. And they, not surprisingly, are primarily located in low-income communities of color. So it's especially important to reduce these and do whatever we can to shut down the peaker power plants and provide reliable energy that can replace that. And solar is one component of that. It's also important because New York City has the oldest grid in the world. Thomas Edison invented electricity and premiered it in New York City. Right now, solar is a small portion of that, but it's very important to grow solar in New York City. And upstate, there's more hydro and nuclear, so the energy mix is more balanced. But in New York City, particularly, it's actually 70% fossil fuel, so gas, oil, and then a little bit of energy from upstate. So it's even more important in New York City to get more renewable energy on the grid. And it's also important for solar jobs. The green jobs are exploding. There's more green jobs being created than traditional fossil fuel jobs. And the more we can have job opportunities in New York City, the better. And it's also beautiful. We like talking about this and highlighting this. I'm sure there are some people on this call who have designed some of these beautiful solar installation. So congratulations on doing something that we love. People are always excited to see solar going up on these houses or buildings. And it's especially great to have it be pioneered with affordable housing, to know that affordable housing developments can get the best, not the worst, as has often happened in the past. So we really love that. And it's also required as part of the Climate Mobilization Act. Local laws 92 and 94 require that either solar or a green roof be on pretty much any unoccupied space on the roof. That is true for all market rate new construction buildings. And until 2024, affordable housing can be exempted if it's not financially feasible. So we'll talk about this more in the next slide, but it is required for all market rate new construction, and it's required for HPD new construction or HPD projects if it is financially feasible. So the next slide shows that HPD worked really hard with us to determine what would be actually beneficial for buildings. We don't want to make buildings install solar if it's not going to benefit their long-term finances. But we do want to include it so that it can make them, so it can achieve all of those benefits we talked about before. So solar is required to, everyone's required to do the feasibility analysis, and solar is required when it has a 10-year payback period or less. So it will save buildings on operating expenses. It can also help reduce the city subsidy. And we can provide these technical resources to make it easy to determine whether solar is a good thing, a medium thing, or a bad thing for a building. So the solar feasibility analysis is a free tool that anyone can use for any type of building, but it's particularly designed for HPD projects, developments. If you look at the results, if you fill in the feasibility analysis and look at the results, if the payback period, which is shown in that yellow box there, is 10 years or less, then solar is required to be included in the scope because it's cost effective and beneficial for the building. If it's over 10 years, it's not required, but often it still is a really good idea. And so we often say solar is not required, but it is recommended. And then it's up to the discretion of the owner and the project manager. You can use the solar feasibility analysis to help you design a system even before it goes to the official review process. So we have a separate training about the feasibility analysis itself. So I'll just gloss over this, but you can find that on our resources webpage. But you can use the building information's input page and the advanced input page to put in whatever information you know about the building. And then the results page will show you what the effect on the financial outlook is based on what you've put in there. And then the instructions and assumptions tab at the beginning of the tool has all of the information you could possibly want as background on how the tool was created. So I'll pass this over to Kate to do a little Solar Technology 101. And again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we will be happy to answer them as we come to the end of the next section.
Great, thanks, Annika. So like Annika mentioned, I'm going to go over just some basics of solar technology to make sure we're all on the same page. So when we talk about solar energy, you'll hear two terms very often, kilowatt versus kilowatt hours. So when we talk about kilowatts, we're talking about a solar energy system's capacity, and really that's the amount of power that the system could produce in ideal conditions. And that capacity is measured in watts or in kilowatts, and in the same way you hear light bulbs talked about. And on a typical solar array in New York City on a multifamily building ranges from a smaller system size of 15 kilowatts to sometimes larger system sizes to 50 kilowatts. That's sort of a good range. Kilowatt hours is a different measurement. So over time, solar installations produce the energy, and that energy is measured in kilowatt hours. And so producing 1 kilowatt hour of solar energy will offset 1 kilowatt hour from utility. So that we use to talk about production and consumption over time. So this is a kind of simplified diagram of how solar works. So the panels will sit on the roof, typically in New York City. The sunlight hits the panels and they generate electricity. That electricity travels to a piece of equipment called an inverter, which sometimes is in the basement, sometimes will be placed on a roof. It's a small piece of equipment. And that inverter converts the direct current electricity into alternating current so that it can be used in the building. And if the building is using the electricity on site, it'll consume whatever electricity is generated. Typically in multifamily buildings, we set it up so that it is used in the common areas. And if there's excess electricity, that will get passed through the meter, essentially making the meter run backwards, which measures that amount of extra electricity. And then it will get sent back to the grid. And Con Edison in Con Edison territory will credit that excess electricity to the building's account. And so that way, at times of day or times of the year when the panels aren't producing as much electricity, so nighttime, winter, when they're shorter days, it can draw on those credits that are in the Con Edison account. So the goal is over the course of a month and over the course of a year, you size the system to generate enough electricity so that it can offset your building's consumption. So in terms of insulation types, there's three main types that we see in New York City. The ballasted array is the most simple. It's very low profile. It sits right on top of the roof using a ballasted system. And that is typically held down with cinder blocks. And because of that, it typically does not require roof penetrations at all. And so it tends to be the least expensive system type, and it's only possible for buildings under 100 feet because of wind loads. And as you can see in the photo, there needs to be spacing in between the rows. So it's a really good system for large roofs on low-rise buildings because they have the space to hold it. The planar array, or sometimes called the mechanically attached array, is, as the name implies, gets mechanically attached into the roof. And so this can be a great system for to increase solar production. As you can see, there's no spacing in between the rows, so you can really build out and maximize the amount of solar on your roof. And because of that, it's often used for space-constrained roofs where you're really wanting to fit as much as you can. And it can go, it can go very low profile as well, or it can be lifted higher if it needs to go over vents or mechanicals. The third type of solar array is a canopy system, and this gets raised at least 9 feet above the roof. And because of that, it can go over, in most cases, Firepaths, and can really maximize the amount of solar on the roof. It tends to be the most expensive because of all the structure and labor required, but it has a lot of co-benefits. So it can allow for tenant space underneath or roof access. And like I said, it can maximize solar. So depending on the roof and the building, there's lots of different options for solar installation. So there's two ways to configure solar, and these are very simplified diagrams, but basically there's net metering, which is basically what I described in the other image, where the electricity generated gets consumed on site where possible, and any excess is sent back to the grid and credited to the account. And a couple of things, and because of this, the system is sized to cover just exactly how much the common area or the owner paid electricity is used. And so when you're looking at buildings, rehabs in particular, and looking at doing things like energy efficiency measures that might make the electricity consumption go down, you want to make sure you're taking that into account when you're sizing your system. And when you're, conversely, when you're electrifying a building and there's going to be a lot more electricity loads, you want to take that into account and perhaps build a larger system. The other method or way to configure solar is called community distributed generation. It's sometimes referred to as community shared solar or CDG, a lot of names for it. But basically the idea here is that all of the energy, all the electricity created gets sent to the grid from the start, and then that energy gets distributed to different accounts, either on site, so it could get distributed to the common area plus tenant units, or it could get distributed off-site to other accounts somewhere else in the city. And on-site distribution is pretty common and relatively simple. Offsite distribution gets much more complicated, and you see that with huge solar arrays that have enough energy to distribute to other places. So in terms of operations and maintenance, solar is very low maintenance. There's typically online monitoring that comes with solar panels that allows for remote diagnosis of any issues as they come up. So we always, recommend that building staff are checking on the solar panels every once in a while, but any real issues that happen, you're going to be able to see through that online monitoring. And we recommend that once a solar system gets installed, the solar company should really do a walkthrough with the building staff so they can show them the ropes and the different components. All solar panels come with a 25-year panel warranty, which is a really good long time and tends to match up really nicely with a roof lifespan. So the best time to install solar is with a new roof or a recently rehabbed roof. And then the inverter, which is that one other kind of main piece of equipment, typically come with a 10 to 12-year inverter warranty. So we always recommend planning for having to replace the inverter around year 15. And then most solar installers come with or provide a 5 to 10-year workmanship warranty. And so if anything goes wrong due to the installation within those initial years, they will come and fix it as part of the warranty. So on HPD's website, there's a solar PV systems owner's guide, which has tons of information about more in depth on these points, but also just what to expect when a solar system is on your roof and the whole process of installation. So we recommend checking out that resource. We're going to send around these slides afterwards with some links as well. So I'm sure that many of your clients or project teams you're working with are very concerned about the economics. So we're going to go just over a couple basics of solar economics so you're able to sort of understand and answer questions as they come up. So the cost of solar is typically talked about in $1 per watt unit cost. And so this format makes it more easy to compare costs across different system sizes. When you're looking at bids, it allows for a comparison of what the installer is the cost. And this chart just shows that system equipment costs have declined dramatically. I think that was the chart Annika showed in the beginning. But in New York City, like with many things in construction, there's still a lot of high soft costs. And so this chart is just showing that as you increase the size of your system, your dollar per watt cost is going to go down because it's spreading out those soft costs over a larger system size. And these are average prices that we got from NYSERDA's information about installations in New York City for the last couple of years. So a couple more factors that might increase or decrease costs. So like I said, a smaller system size, that dollar per watt cost is going to go up. Other increases happen mechanically integrated or canopy systems tend to be a little bit more expensive because they need more robust structural systems. And then the taller the building, particularly over 7 stories, will increase costs. And things like prevailing wage or other requirements for the project will also make the cost go up. But that cost can come down, like I said, when there's a larger system size or a simpler installation like a ballasted where there's no need for roof penetration. And doing competitive and bulk procurement can really help bring the system cost down. And so often when we have lots of small little buildings that we're seeing coming in through HPD, we can group those together and get more competitive pricing than you otherwise would for a really small system size because we're bidding them out together. And this chart just shows some of how those factors play out in the numbers. And just a note, like with other subcontractors, if the GC is subcontracting the solar installer, they'll typically include a markup. And this icon just is reminding us that if you want to use the solar feasibility analysis, it'll take into account things like building height, what the system type, if prevailing wage is being used or required, and that'll factor in when you look at the results page. It'll tell you what the estimated system dollar per watt cost is based on those factors. So that's a really helpful tool for you to start thinking about how much is going to cost the project. So this is a big chart with lots of words on it that I'm not going to go through all together, but like I said, we'll send it out after. But the point is to show you that there's lots of incentives and rebates that can really help bring the project costs down and make it affordable for especially affordable housing to go solar. So there's state tax incentives, federal tax credits, city tax abatements, and depending on the project and the the ownership type, they may or not be eligible for these. But in the end, we see that these incentives can offset anywhere from 50 to 80% of the total system costs and really make it feasible for affordable housing to go solar. And as you digest this, after we send the slides out, if you have any questions about incentives, you can always reach out to us, and we're happy to walk you through the changes and how they might impact your project. And the tool, another plug for the solar feasibility analysis, it has built into it questions that will help determine which incentives the project would be eligible for, and then show you how much savings you would obtain on your project from these different inputs. Great, so that was a lot of information. We'll pause for a minute and see if there's any questions that have come up. All right, I see Doris has asked about zoning. We're going to talk about zoning in a minute. So thanks for that question. Yeah, we'll dive a little bit more into permitted obstruction. So hold that thought for just one more minute. Okay. Great. I think we'll move on. I'll pass it back to Annika.
Oh, we just got a question. Do panels need to be cleaned regularly? And that's a great question. The answer is in New York City, New York in general, for better or for worse, it rains a lot. And so the rain actually does all of the work necessary to clean the panels. It is an issue in places like Arizona where you get a lot of dust, but that's not an issue that we face. And snow is also good for the panels because it kind of scrubs them as it falls off. And so the panels are designed to be cleaned by the weather, which is great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to design for solar with solar optimization in mind. The first thing to think about is the shape of the building. And obviously there are many considerations that go into the shape of the building. Zoning is not the least of them. But in an ideal world, the best places for solar is large rectangular buildings with large contiguous spaces. So the three that are shown here, an H-shaped building, a block, and L-shaped building, they all have this much space for solar panels. And you can see on that building that does have solar, there's one smaller array on the kind of nub that's sticking out. And that's fine, but if that section were smaller, or if there are other smaller sections, it would be harder and harder to fit a cost-effective solar system in lots of small different places. So another consideration is that very skinny buildings, brownstones and 8-unit buildings or less can often be a little bit more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult because FDNY requires a 6-foot clear path from front to back and side to side. And on these buildings, that 6 feet takes up a large percentage of the space. So there are ways to get around that, and it's definitely not impossible, but better to avoid if you can. And then stepped roofs, you could imagine, are a little bit more challenging as well because they reduce the contiguous area. So you need lots of smaller arrays in different places. It's, again, still possible, but much harder to do solar when there's not as much open contiguous space. And this, again, is a good place to use the solar feasibility analysis. You can use the square footage of the roof that you have and put that in, and the feasibility analysis will estimate how much solar you can fit in a given space. Another important thing to consider is shading. In single family homes, that's usually shading from trees, but in New York, it tends to be shading from other buildings. The most important thing to keep in mind is southern exposure. So where we live, the sun is most often in the south when it matters most, and or half of the year the sun is mostly in the southern part of the sky. And so it's especially important for buildings to have exposure to the south. So this building that is outlined in red here is just to the north of the taller tower. That I wouldn't recommend for solar at all. It's just never going to be a financially viable system. However, the building just to the south of it is the same distance from the tower, but it's south of the tower, and so it would be completely fine. It's an ideal candidate for solar. Keep in mind that roof structures can also create shading. So if you have an elevator bulkhead that's at the southernmost point of a roof, that'll probably make unfeasible more of the roof than if you put the bulkhead at the northernmost point of a roof. Firepaths are also very important. So the rules from FDNY are that any street spacing side must have a 6-foot clear path or landing area for firefighters to put up their ladders and get up to the roof. There also must be a fire path that goes from side to side and front to back of each section of the building. So if it's an H-shaped building, it needs to be both lines of the H. Any access point that someone could get to the roof from, like a bulkhead door or a fire escape, also has to connect to the fire path. You probably know this from other things, but it's good to keep it in mind with solar. Another thing to know about fire paths is that while all of these rules are true, you can also maximize the system size by putting the fire path in the place that would otherwise be shaded by bulkheads, or running it along the perimeter of the roof so that it doesn't cut straight down the middle of where a solar installation could go. And if you want to get into the nitty-gritty details, Fire Code section 504.4.4 has all of the rules. So there was a question about zoning, so we'll go into zoning here. Zone green, which was passed a few years ago, allows solar as a permitted obstruction to a point. So solar panels can penetrate the maximum height limit or the sky exposure plane up to 4 feet. And then if you have a canopy, it can penetrate it more than 4 feet up to as long as it's no more than 25% of the lot coverage of the roof. And so we can go through this more, but the addition of 4 feet to the maximum height or sky exposure plane, and the ability to have a portion of it, not the whole roof, but a portion of it above that, definitely gives a lot more possibility than there used to be before Zone Green was passed. It's still not perfect. There are definitely places where canopies aren't allowed, but any lower profile solar system, so a ballasted system or a planar, a low profile planar array, should be totally fine in terms of zoning. And if you want to read up on that, Article 2, Chapter 3 has Zone Green. So if you're fitting everything on the roof, the things to keep in mind are, like I said, you want a large available area, as little shading as possible, and making sure that what shading there is happens in the north. So in this picture, the north is on the street side. So you can see their mechanical equipment is in the north of the roof, and so the solar panels are not affected. There's only 2 panels that are partially shaded by that, and the rest of them are completely fine. And also the fire path is along the perimeter, so it's not bisecting the solar arrays, which makes it much easier. I think I've said this before, but bulkheads on the northern side makes a big difference, and you can see that here. You can arrange solar panels around vents and mechanicals, or canopies can be raised above vents and often mechanical equipment. However, if it's possible to cluster them as much as possible, that's always the best thing, because if you can see, a single pipe vent would take out an entire solar panel. So if you can have, 3 in one space, then that would make it more efficient use. And as I said, the fire paths that go along the perimeter or along areas that are already shaded are the most efficient use of space. I also want to point out that solar is great, if not necessary, for all electric buildings. And since electric buildings is the future, we're all going to have to make all new construction buildings are going to be electrified. I think the importance of making solar work is even more pronounced. And like I was saying earlier, solar panels can be raised above mechanical equipment, usually a canopy array or even a high planar array, which isn't as expensive, can be created to use the, if there's HVAC equipment that needs to go on the roof, that can be paired with solar very easily. And again, this is a great opportunity to use the solar feasibility analysis to see how much solar would offset of the common area costs, and how you could pair that with mechanicals. So if you're drawing solar arrays as part of the architectural plan, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. We already went through the 3 different types of systems. And so ballasted, the thing to draw is that they need rows. So they're spaced about 1 foot apart, and they have to avoid any and all roof obstructions, even drains and vents. And you should avoid shading from parapet walls, because parapet walls are usually about 4 feet high. And so if you put the panels right up next to it, they'll probably be shaded. A planar system doesn't need space between the rows. They can be lifted, so they don't, it's not as important for them to be, to avoid shading. They're usually tilted at a 5 to 10 degree angle. That's actually true for the ballasted system as well. So if you're designing that, make sure to put it at that tilt. And the arrays themselves need to be shaded so that they don't, need to be spaced so they don't shade each other. And if this is an issue, it's important that the planar and canopy systems are not visible from the street if it's in a historic district. Canopy also has no space between the rows. It's usually the lowest point is 9 feet in the air, and they're usually tilted less. So it's maybe, I'd actually say like a 0 to 5 degree angle, but 2 to 5 is most common. And they can cover the whole roof, except for the required FDNY landing areas. Like we said before, canopy has to comply with zoning regulations. So that extra 4 feet plus the maximum height. But they can cover pretty much anything. Often they could even cover the bulkhead roof if the height allows it. And then also for drawing things, usually solar panels are about 6 feet by 3 feet in rectangles. Sometimes they're different, but that's a good estimate to use. Making a building solar ready. So if you're designing a new construction building, it's very easy to do these things that can end up being costly if the solar installer has to do it themselves. So the first thing is conduit from the roof to the electrical room. So if you include a 2-inch conduit for solar, It's not always 2 inches, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Then that it's much easier to do it as you construct the building than for the solar installer to have to install it after the fact. It's also good to have a 3-foot square area for inverters in the electrical room, or sometimes they can be put on the side of a bulkhead on the roof. But it's usually better if it can be done with all of the other electrical equipment. And making sure that the common area service panel has enough amperage to support a future system. It would be a shame to build a new building and new electrical equipment and then have to replace it immediately after with a higher capacity service panel that to be able to accommodate the solar. So it's important to take that into account. A little bit more detail on canopies. Like we've said, it can be a great way to maximize solar, and often it can even be a cost-effective way to do it. If there's not enough space on the roof to do a large enough system, a canopy may be even cheaper than a mechanically attached or ballasted system, just because it would be a much larger system. On new construction projects, often canopies are built on structural steel beams that are just continued from the structure of the building and extended 10 feet higher. This obviously requires a lot of coordination between the solar installer and the general contractor of the building. And the architect is responsible for designing that structure, but it can be much more cost effective than adding steel to the roof after the fact, and better for the roof. So if a canopy is planned, then we often recommend doing it that way. And like I said before, canopies can leave space for firepaths, so you can have solar over the required firepaths, but they do require those landing areas on the edges of the buildings, so they can't cover absolutely everything. And you can always note that canopies are preferred in the solar feasibility analysis. There are a couple of different ways to attach a canopy to a roof. So one option is attaching it directly to the roof deck, as you can see in this design. This is done with piping, just standard piping. And so it's more, this one is clearly over mechanical equipment. It's not for tenant use, but it achieves all of the required specifications. And then the other option would be structural steel. This is in the context where you'd want it to look nicer, have availability for people to walk and hang out underneath it. Tends to be more expensive, but has that extra benefit. And another option in the kind of structural steel category is attaching the canopy racking to the parapet wall itself. If the roof deck isn't capable of holding the specific weight. And for this building in particular, they had a floating roof, and so it didn't make sense to attach the supports to the roof deck itself, so they attached it to the parapet walls. And there are a number of different creative designs from different solar installers that do canopies. So that's definitely something that we can help you explore how to do canopies. So this example, the canopy support is thrust down about a story on the exterior of the building. So it's supported not just on the parapet wall like we just saw, but also on the building wall itself. So there's lots of different options. Keep in mind that there are other uses of the roof that you can do at the same time as solar. So you can use solar and a green roof together. You can do solar and a blue roof, water collection for stormwater. With a canopy, you can do tenant recreation space. And it's definitely good to incorporate solar early in the design process. but you don't have to. Solar is required where the roof isn't being used for something else. So if a roof is being used for a tenant recreation space, or if the usable roof area is too small, then solar isn't required. Okay, any questions here?
I don't think we have any new ones, so great, keep moving. And someone did ask if you can put inverters outside, and the answer is yes, they can go outside. Sometimes they get attached to bulkhead walls on the exterior, but like Annika said, they're also often put in the mechanical room. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through just sort of where solar fits in the installation process, particularly with HPD processes, HPD projects, since I know many of you are working with HPD. So during pre-construction, like Annika said, the best time to do solar feasibility analysis is very early on, both because then you can better incorporate it into the plans, get an installer on board earlier, and maximize and enhance the design for the building. It's also required for HPD projects that are going through EGC or LEED to submit the solar feasibility analysis as part of the pre-build process. And once you get your approval from solar feasibility analysis approved by HPD, you'll move on to procuring a solar installer and selecting an installer. And this can be done before closing or after. It's often done before closing so that you can get the most accurate pricing for your budget. Yeah, once the construction starts, your solar installer will start doing the design and permitting, early on, and then their installation is best done when they can coordinate with the roofer. And so sometimes they'll do it in conjunction, especially for mechanically attached or canopy systems. They'll work hand in hand with the roofer to make sure all roofing warranties are maintained. And then after the solar installation goes on, the installer is responsible for getting all the inspections and commissioning complete. So as we mentioned, solar HPD has this sort of rubric to determine whether solar will be required for their projects. And so, like we mentioned, any project with a 10-year payback or less, solar is going to be required. Projects that have between an 11 and 15-year payback, solar is still often recommended because of all the benefits it has to the building and financially, and often has minimal subsidy impact. So even though it's not required, it'll still be recommended. And then projects with over a 15-year payback, we don't typically recommend this, but Solar One is happy to work with projects to help figure out if there is a way to do a redesign or to figure out what might bring that cost down if a building owner is really interested in going solar. And then for projects with new roofs or replacing a roof deck that have to comply with local law 92 and 94, if they need an exemption because the roof cannot support at least 4 kilowatts of solar, or the payback period is over 10 years, then the exemption will be approved and HPD can send that DOB exemption letter. So if one of your projects wants to move forward with solar and or has to move forward with solar, we're always happy at Solar One to help you with procuring an installer. And so basically, we just like to know as early as possible so that we can make sure to do a really thorough RFP process. And if it's a small system size, like I mentioned before, we can try to bundle it together with other smaller system sizes to make sure we get as competitive and low pricing as possible. And basically, we would create bid documents, run the RFP, and then prepare a really detailed bid comparison form to provide to the project team so that they can make a determination as to which solar installer they want to move forward with. And HPD has a set of solar requirements and best practices. You can find it on their website, but they're pretty straightforward, mostly things like making sure the contractor participates in the New York Sun incentive program, that they're complying with all codes and technical requirements. And that those requirements are also available in the owner's guide for solar PV systems I mentioned before. And yeah, this and many other links are on the Solar Where Feasible website. Great. And I'll pass it over to Annika for just a few examples before we wrap up.
Okay, so I want to talk about 15 Stratford. As you may remember from our initial viability discussion, this is a great building for solar. Actually, all of the buildings in this area are. So if you go to the next slide, this building had a 30 kilowatt system installed on it. It only needed 15 kilowatts to cover their common area costs. So what they did was they installed a system that was double the size that they needed, and then allocated half of the credits to the tenants in the building to reduce their costs as well. And because of the incentives available, the building owner was actually better off financially because of the larger system to be and also reducing the tenants' costs. So it was a win-win situation there. So this was a mid-sized rental building. It was a HPD preservation project, and it worked out really well for everyone. 838 Park Place was an HDFC co-op. So this is also a community solar situation where they covered both the common area and a substantial portion of each apartment's usage as well. As you can see, they really covered the rooftop with solar as much as they could. And this is in a historic district. So you can see historic districts don't preclude solar. You just have to make sure that it's not visible from the street. And the way that this is designed, it's not visible from the street, which is too bad because it's very beautiful. And then an example of a new construction project, Fisher Senior Apartments, is a good example here. Solar was included on the main roof deck, and then also on the roof of the mechanical room. So they're able to maximize the system size there. This was a low-income housing tax credit project, 9% LIHTC, but because 9% LIHTC is pretty restricted, solar was not included in the LIHTC basis. That's something that you can choose. You can turn on and off on the solar feasibility analysis. But the tax credit investor is able to take the solar investment tax credit and accelerated depreciation and the other incentives. And so it's still a very viable system that benefits both the building's operating expenses and the ownership. So I think that's it for our short case studies. We've got 5 more minutes here, so we are happy to answer any questions about any other aspects of solar or anything that we've covered so far. And we'll stay on for that. Thank you all so much for joining, and reach out to us if you have any particular buildings that you're working with that we can help you troubleshoot. Nina asks, are there any systems that are used to heat water directly? That's a great question. There used to be a lot of solar hot water panels. I remember my parents actually, when I was younger, got solar hot water on their roof, and it was they felt like pioneers. But at this point, PV, the solar electrical systems, are just so much cheaper that it's actually better to pair solar PV photovoltaic panels with a heat pump electric hot water heater, and then heat hot water that way. Solar hot water systems tend to have a lot more maintenance costs. They're harder to keep going, and so we always recommend just solar electric. Thanks, everyone. I'm gonna put the link to the Solar Where Feasible page in the chat again, and we'll send out the PDF of this presentation as well afterwards, so you can keep it in your notes. But this is, yeah, I think this page is where you can find the most useful information.
And there's a link to, in that page, there's a link to our Here Comes Solar landing page, which also has previous recordings and other trainings. So it has this training. It also has how to ace your solar feasibility analysis. So if you're the one filling out the solar feasibility analysis and have questions, that's a great place to start. And it also has a training on solar for mid-cycle building. So lots of great resources that we encourage you to peruse. I'm not seeing any questions. Annika and I will stick around for a couple more minutes if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining.
It looks like we have one question from Pablo. Will any future HPD project require the solar panels if the payback period is under 10 years? My last project got a waiver, the payback period of 9 years. So typically, if it's 10 years or under, it's required. I don't know which project that was, but there may have been some extenuating circumstance where HPD was willing to grant an exemption. But I would have to know more about the project. But the rule, the hard and fast rule is 10 years or under, it's required.
Yeah, it might have been a enterprise green level. So if it was part of enterprise green 2015 rules rather than 2020 rules, that it wasn't required for the buildings that were still going in under UGC 2015. But pretty much all of the buildings that are going through now, solar is required under 10 years. And just a reminder that in 2024, the 10-year distinction isn't going to be an issue. Solar will just be required on new buildings, regardless of affordable status.
And if the roof is landscaped, then in the local law 9294 rules, solar would not be required because the rule is that the roof either has solar or a green roof. And so things like green roofs or tenant space are an acceptable reason to exempt solar. Have you worked with solar pavers? Annika, you may have more experience with that. I have not.
We haven't worked with solar pavers. They're one of those like building integrated PV systems that that seem really great in concept and in practice tend to not work very well. If you think about pavers, people walk on them. They get a little bit more abuse than a usual solar panel, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend that unless and until someone can really prove them out as a good alternative. There's been a lot of new innovative ideas for better ways to create solar panels, but despite that, solar panels are almost identical these days as they were in the 70s when Jimmy Carter put them up on the White House. So I'm usually fairly skeptical of the latest, greatest solar innovation until it's really tested in the market.
And then we can answer this one final question before we hop off. So Shauna asks, have you seen batteries used in conjunction with solar to replace emergency generators?
You can answer that, Kate.
So right now, actually, a team at Solar One, the Resilient Solar team, is working on installing solar plus storage, so solar and batteries, at a couple key sites, public institutions, libraries, and other places places particularly that were hit by Hurricane Sandy. It is very challenging right now because it's still somewhat of a new technology. And so there's lots of hurdles, regulatory and just cost-wise, and making sure the batteries are safe and fire testing and things like that. So at this moment in time, it's pretty cost prohibitive to be able to do. But we're hopeful that as more and more of these pilot programs are experimenting and exploring how to do it, it'll bring down the barriers so that more people can use solar and battery in New York City, because that's definitely, yeah, something we're really hoping for and needing for resilience purposes.
At this point, though, I think that the fairly firm answer is no. Unfortunately, it's both costs and regulations from the fire department. It's almost impossible in New York City to install batteries, unfortunately. Okay, on that note, which is such a downer because solar in general is very possible. Thank you all again for coming and for staying on to ask questions. We look forward to hearing from you about other projects, and we'll see you at our next training.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.